First off, my name is Andy Serwich from Altaro Software here. We have a fantastic webinar lined up for you guys today. And we got Ben Armstrong here. How's it going, Ben?
It is good. It is bright and early, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, you got your cup of coffee handy there with you?
Yeah, I absolutely do. You're going to see me sipping out of this occasionally.
Sounds good. Well, hey, Ben, really quick, are you able to see the slide deck?
Yeah, I can, and I can now see you.
Hey, all right, sounds good, sounds good. Well, all right, well, again, I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Again, my name is Andy Serwich, got Ben Armstrong here, and this is really kind of a first as far as webinars go for us. Now, usually here at Altaro, we do more of a educational style webinar where, hey, here's the topic, and we're going to teach you about said topic. Now, today we're doing that a little bit differently. We've got Ben here from Microsoft, who is on the virtualization team at Microsoft. He knows a great deal about containers. If you have any questions about containers, this is the guy you want to talk to. So we took that idea and we figured we'd put that together in today's webinar and do more of an AMA style. So bring your questions. We've got just the guy to answer those for you. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at our introductions and our schedule for the day here. So first we're going to get started with some introductions. Again, myself, Ben, Altaro, who's the sponsor of today's webinar. And then we're going to talk about today's format. How can you, the attendees, kind of interact and talk with Ben and myself here. Then I've kind of broken things down into three main areas here. First, what are containers? What are they made up of? What are the different components? What are their functions? Those are the types of questions that we're going to handle in that section of the talk today. Then we're going to get into use case. Now, personally, I found in the IT pros that I talk in the industry, this is where most of the questions that I run into come into, is what the use case is. So we'll probably spend quite a good bit of time on that today. Then we're going to talk about management, because again, we're putting these containers out there, we got to manage them, right? And how we're going to do that. And finally, at that point, we're going to do kind of a final Q&A at the end. What we'll do once we get to that point is, because this is kind of a Microsoft-centric webinar, I'm going to do just a quick demo of our Altaro VM backup cloud backup option, while Ben kind of has a chance to look at the final questions there before our final Q&A. So just a heads up on that. So let's go ahead and get started with introductions. So again, my name is Andy Serwich. I'm kind of acting as your host today. I'm going to be quarterbacking the questions between you and Ben. And I'm a Microsoft MVP in the cloud and data center management competency, also a VMware vExpert, and I'm a technical evangelist for Altaro Software. I've been in the industry for a while. My focus has always been on the Windows Server Stack, Azure, VMware, and my emphasis really has always been on Hyper-V virtualization and vSphere technologies as well. I'm out on Twitter at @aserwich. My friends keep telling me I need to change my handle to @AndySandwich to make it a little bit easier for people to find me. So maybe I'll do that at some point, but I haven't yet. And I also blog out on the Altaro blogs, altaro.com/hyper-v and /VMware respectively. And I will hand it over to Ben for your introduction.
So howdy, I'm Ben Armstrong, Principal Program Manager on the Hyper-V team at Microsoft. And yeah, as the slide says, I've been working on virtualization for over 20 years now, which is an eternity. So I've originally worked on virtual PC, virtual server, Hyper-V containers, Windows subsystem for Linux. Basically anything virtualization in the Windows world, I've had a hand in it. And yeah, my Twitter handle and blog are right there. And always happy for people to hit me up with questions at any time.
That sounds good. Thanks, Ben. A little word about today's sponsor. Again, the company I work for, Altaro Software. We're a fast-growing developer of some pretty awesome, easy-to-use backup software, specifically for the SMB in the mid-market and for MSPs that are operating in that space as well. That backup solution is used by 40,000 plus customers and 7,000 plus partners and MSPs worldwide. And that is Altaro VM Backup. If you want a little bit more information on that, feel free to go to the URL right there for more information. So let's actually talk about today's format. So again, this is an AMA style webinar. This is all about discussion, So feel free to ask your questions. There is a questions form. You see a picture of it there on the left-hand side of the screen. There's a questions form in GoToWebinar. Feel free to ask your questions. We will get to them as we can throughout each section here. And then, like I said, we'll also do a big final Q&A session here at the end as well, in case, you know, maybe there's a question that you didn't get answered at first, or something along those lines. So you feel free to ask questions throughout the entire webinar today. With that, you know, Ben is going to do his best to answer each and every question, but, you know, I put this in here that he can reserve the right to refuse certain questions if it broaches, you know, a sensitive topic or reserved information or something. So I gave you an out there, Ben. Just
thank you. I appreciate
it. So you have it just in case. So absolutely. So with that, again, go ahead and start throwing your questions out there, and we will start answering them. So I figured what we would do, Ben, is we would kind of start at, you know, kind of the beginning point for somebody
absolutely.
who's, so somebody who's absolutely new to containers and microservices. And being our crowd, our attendees are probably mostly from an IT pro perspective. I think some probably dabble in the dev and DevOps side. But that's kind of where I wanted to start, was really, what are containers? Can you kind of tell us what Microsoft's definition of a container is?
This is a far more controversial question than it should be. You know, and there's a bunch of questions that I've seen come in preparation for this AMA, where I'm like, oh, that is a good question, but I also know that people are wanting a really crisp answer, and instead I'm going to give a complicated story and be like, the answer is kind of vague and fuzzy. You know, I do want to just kind of step through this. I'm going to give a long answer to this, because containers are really new technology, and people tend to forget that when technologies are new, we don't entirely know what the shape of them is. You know, two examples that I like to give for this is, I remember I often go out on the road, I'd meet with customers, I do customer site visits, and I come back and I report to the team about, like, hey, here's what I saw and here's what's going on. And I remember I'm gonna say it was 2013, I did a trip out to Europe, and I met with a bunch of hosting companies. And one of the things I came back to the team with, I said, yes, this is an important moment. And I was like, we got half a dozen customers in a room, and I asked them, what does it mean when we say cloud? And they actually agreed on the answer.
Wow.
You know, and another situation, you know, I've had customers occasionally say, like, Ben, I feel like you guys at Microsoft come up with these buzzwords and you go around saying them until you figure out what they mean. And this is often the case. You know, it's often the case that we see a problem, we have an idea for how to solve that problem, we give that idea a name, and then we spend a bunch of time going back and forth with customers and iterating and figuring out that, like, oh, wait a second, this bit of the idea works and that bit doesn't. This bit is important and that bit isn't. And that's very much where we are with containers right now. You know, we saw a problem, we had some ideas, we're working on it, and we're kind of learning as we go together. So let's talk about, like, what's the problem that we saw, and then what's some of the learnings that we're having. So the problem that we saw is, and this is a fun little thing to step people through, is the problem that we saw is virtual machines aren't really well designed for the cloud. And that often makes people take a step back, because in their minds, cloud and virtual machines are synonymous. Right. But the reality is, we built virtual machines in the late 90s. You know, and I like to put people back in the Wayback Machine and go, like, I can remember one of the first big problems that I worked on when working on the original version of Windows Virtual PC was I was working with a number of enterprises who were trying to figure out how to set up Virtual PC using their Norton Ghost images. Like,
oh boy.
Call out to anyone on the call who remembers Norton Ghost. You know, that used to be the way you image systems. But that is kind of the world that virtual machines were built for. And then the cloud was actually built on top of virtual machines. Um, but then we have a whole bunch of these artifacts and these behaviors that don't make sense anymore. Um, and really, the whole effort around containers was about going like, okay, how do we solve the problem that virtual machines solve, but do it in a way that makes sense for the cloud, you know. And so there were a whole bunch of things that, decisions that were made. Like, we can assume that there's a redundant, reliable infrastructure underneath us. We can assume that there's a management plane in place. We can assume that, and we can make all these assumptions because it's in a cloud environment. And then what can we do to improve it? So against that background, a couple of the key defining characteristics of a container. And I'm not going to be super consistent in level here. So a couple of key defining characteristics. The first one is they are really fast to provision. This has been a big focus. They're fast to provision, they're fast to start. And once again, let's kind of do the little journey and the unpack here. When we first started working on virtual machines, and most of us have forgotten how bad things used to be in the dark old days pre-virtualization. But in the dark days pre-virtualization, if you go back to like the mid-90s, if you're in the mid-90s and you're working in an IT department, and one of your engineers says like, oh, I'm working on a project and I need a new web server, you would be proud if you could get that web server stood up in under a month. Because the reality was, in the mid-90s, this would involve ordering hardware. And ordering hardware would involve budget and a review and so on. So if you were good, you could do it in a month, because if you were good, you had all the paperwork down, you had your supplier lined up, you could get it approved, you could get the hardware ordered, it would turn up in like a week and a half, you would get it racked up, you would get it set up, and it was all by hand and yada, yada, yada. That was the world that we started in, and when we started doing virtual machines, it was amazing because you could do that in an hour or two. And that was revolutionary. But that was yesterday. When we look at the cloud world and the sort of solutions that we're trying to build now, the idea that like it's going to take 30 minutes to provision a VM and get everything set up and running starts being really problematic. So with containers, we can deploy and start in seconds instead of in dozens of minutes. So that's the first kind of big difference here is the speed aspect. The second big difference is density. Once again, physical to virtual, we saw this great, increase in the amount of work you could get out of your physical hardware. But containers really take it up another notch. If we have a physical computer that can run a workload, it can run about a dozen, virtual machines. It can run hundreds of containers. So density is kind of the next aspect. The third aspect that comes in, and this is really the flip side, and this is where we're going to change gears a bit, is where like, what did we have to change in order to get that speed, that density? And the change is where virtual machines are really about give me an operating system. Virtual machines are like, I want a copy of Windows that I'm going to do stuff with. Containers are really about, I have an app I want to run. That's really the mental model that you have with a container. I mean, yes, you can create a blank container and just go in and tool around inside it. It's not really the mental model that it was made for. It's made for, like, I have an IIS server, I have an ASP.NET app, I have an app I want to run, and kind of having that intent ahead of time is a lot of what allows us to reach the other things. So those are the three things I call out. Now, the fun thing over the last couple of years has been about learning what doesn't matter in the definition of a container. So let me kind of step through that, because I would have given you a very different answer to this question 2 years ago.
Gotcha.
So, and to give some background on this, when we talk about containers today, a bit of the kind of the engineering operating system architecture background here. So both Windows and Linux have had the building blocks for containers kind of bouncing around in the operating system for a long time. There are bits of Windows containers that I can trace back to like 2007. I can remember engineers working on bits of that then.
Wow.
And it was really only a couple of years ago that we had this company, Docker, come out and start pulling together these bits of technology and presenting a user experience which actually clicked for people, and actually made people go like, oh, that's something that I can use. And when they started doing that, they chose a way to do file system virtualization. They chose a way to do network virtualization. They chose a bunch of different tools in the toolkit. And one of the things that they chose was to do the operating system virtualization at the kernel level instead of at the hypervisor level. And they did that so that they could get the speed that you want for containers. And when we started looking at this and being like, okay, how do we support this? We very strongly had in our mind that, like, yeah, the speed is super important. So the virtualization has to be done at the kernel level, not at the hypervisor level. And so we started building this, and we were working on this for a little while, and we actually had an internal review where we, on the virtualization team, went and presented to the leadership of Azure and said, like, hey, we're building this cool containers thing. We think it's, we're designing it for the cloud. We think it's going to be really interesting. And we're kind of going through it for them. And we get halfway through the discussion and we get to the stage where we're like, this uses kernel virtualization instead of hypervisor virtualization. And they go, whoa, time out. No. And we're like, what? And they're like, no, we do not do that. They're like, we're a public cloud. We need hypervisor virtualization. And the primary reason was we want the security promise. And we were like, well, that's kind of a tough nut to crack. And they were like, well, go back to the drawing board. And so we did. And so that's where, if you look at Windows today, we actually have two types of containers. We have the Windows Server containers and we have Hyper-V containers. And Windows Server containers are our container solution that uses kernel virtualization. Hyper-V containers are our container solution that uses hypervisor virtualization. Now, the thing that's been fascinating to watch over the last kind of 12 months is that we've seen two things happening. The first thing that we've seen happening is we've seen our customers making the same call that Azure did. We've seen our customers going like, I like containers, but I want hypervisor security. I'm going with Hyper-V containers. The second thing that we've seen is we're seeing a lot of activity on the Linux side of the world, where the Linux side of the world is now kind of coming to the same realization, where they're like, we like this containers technology, but when we want to go into production, we need hypervisor virtualization. And so we're seeing a lot of activity there. And so that's an example of, something where 2 years ago, I would have said, oh, containers, they're kernel virtualization. Whereas today I'm like, the virtualization engine is debatable. It's all about the characteristics.
Gotcha.
So there's my long-winded answer. So I know I saw some questions come in. Matt had the question, is the Microsoft definition different than the industry version? Hopefully I've kind of touched on this. The definition is very much in flux. We actually spend a bunch of time working with the different companies and with our counterparts on the Linux side. We actually deeply involved in the Docker project. And just over the last couple of weeks, I've been spending a bunch of time working with the guys on the Kata Containers project, which is currently one of the leading Linux projects for doing the equivalent of Hyper-V containers on Linux. So I will say, with all of this background, you absolutely will find container architectural purists out there who are like, no, if it's not kernel virtualization, it's not a container. That is not what we're seeing in reality. In reality, the lines are a lot more gray.
Okay. Yeah, that's some good insight, Ben. And there was another question that we got here that kind of tied into what you were saying. Mainly when you were talking a little bit about kind of the architecture of a virtual machine versus a container itself, and that Trevor here mentioned that, hey, I could provision a VM in about 1 minute. Maybe I'm doing it wrong was kind of the question.
No, you're doing it right, but
right. But that comes back to the discussion about really the sizing differences and the makeup of the operating system inside of that container, right? Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, and I love to talk about this when I talk about we built containers for the cloud. And what I like to talk about is I like to say, I'm really worried that I'm going to kick out my cord. So if I go dead at any stage, let me know. I've got a long cord going down, and I tend to walk when I talk. So when I'm doing public presentations about containers, the most basic presentation, demo I like to do is I bring up a blank system, and I run a single Docker command, Docker run -it to give me an interactive terminal, Windows, and a command. And I show that in a couple of seconds, it spins up a container. And I show you that, like, hey, look, this is a unique container with some unique things. And I step through and I talk about it. And then I go on and I go like, okay, let's build an IIS server and so on. And in about 5 minutes on stage, I show you how to build an IIS server container layered on top of the Windows Server container image that we provide. It's a nice, simple demo. But what I then like to step people through is I like to say, now, if you've worked in IT, this is a similar pattern. Like, this pattern, because what you've been doing in cloud computing is you do this with VMs. You create a golden image, you have it all patched and configured and sysprepped, and when you spin up a new VM, you do a differencing disk off of that, and yeah, you can provision a new VM in under a minute. But the big difference here is, the first thing is, at this stage, and unfortunately I can't do that in this format, I love to ask my audience, okay, show of hands, how many people here have ever got an unattended XML file perfect the first time? Because no one ever has. I never have. It's awful. And what I then step people through is, like, what you tend to gloss over in all that story is that for the average person, creating that golden image, getting that all set up, getting everything going, that was days of your life. And maintaining that golden image and keeping all of that infrastructure is substantial time. Doing that entire workflow on containers is literally minutes. Because we provide the base images, we maintain the base images because the system is built for this. And one of the things I like to step people through just to call this out is you never ever run sysprep in a container. And why is that? And this really comes back to the virtual machines were built for the physical world and containers are built for the cloud. Because if you think through what sysprep is a tool to tell an installation of Windows, hey, something crazy is about to happen. The next time you start, you're going to be on a different piece of hardware. That's what sysprep is. And if you're a copy of Windows installed on a physical computer, that is something crazy. But if you're a copy of Windows in the cloud, that is not. That is normal operating procedure. And so what we actually did was when we built the Windows image that we use for the container runtime, we actually modified Windows to be like, every time you start, it's a new world. So you don't have to sysprep containers because the version of Windows that we run inside containers knows every time it starts, it's a new world. So conceptually, the VM and container workflow is very similar. The difference is we have pulled out all the stuff you had to do to try and trick this thing that was designed for a physical world to be efficient in a cloud world and said, no, we're just going to default to that.
Gotcha. All right, good deal. Hey, we need to move on to the next section here pretty quick here, Ben. But
yeah, I'm sorry, I always do long answers.
Hey, no worries, no worries. There's one other question that we got actually on Reddit that I wanted to address really quick because this slide talks about specific requirements as well. We got a question on Reddit about the Hyper-V dependency for installing Docker on Windows. Yep. And how he mentions that he's developing on mobile apps that require a disabled Hyper-V and web services, but due to Docker's on Windows, Hyper-V has to be enabled, so there's kind of a collision there. Can you address that a little bit?
So this is where I have to demur and say top secret, because we actually have something that we may be announcing here at an event that may be happening in a couple of weeks that may be targeted at developers. Maybe you can put the dots together here. So this is a pain point that we are very well aware of, and we do plan to solve it, albeit in a way that I think no one is predicting. But I'm highly confident that that user is going to be happy in a month's time.
Yeah, all right, sounds good.
Vague hand wavy. Stay tuned. Check out the build event. It's going to be fun. We have a lot of really cool virtualization technology that we're going to be talking about at build. I'm super excited.
Sounds exciting. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was use case. Now, me personally, this is probably where I get the most questions about containers. Because like I said, primarily our audience is primarily IT pro. And historically, they've seen containers as being, well, it's more of a dev thing, right? But now the lines are blurring a little bit. So now they're starting to wonder, okay, what are these container things and where and how do they fit? So maybe as just kind of a start here, what is Microsoft's intended use case for containers?
And I'm going to answer with a story because I always answer with stories, Andy. Sorry.
No,
this one I love, because I've been working in virtualization forever, being involved in a number of releases, and the thing I always like to point out is we always get our use case wrong in the first release, and containers are no exception. Every time we do something brand new, we have an idea of like, we think this is how people are going to use it, and we release it and they go use it in a completely different way, and we're always like, okay, pivot, go figure out how to make that work. And containers have followed that pattern through and through. So when we were first building containers, we really got it into our head that, like, this is going to be a great tool for developers. This is going to be a great tool for building your new applications that you're going to run in the cloud. And that's really where we focused. We were like, developers, developers, developers. We're going to, focus on this, and that's where we put all our messaging and all our effort and so on. And we got it out there, and we were completely wrong. And instead, there were two other sections that we have seen take off like crazy. The first thing, which caught us completely by surprise, is just the sheer number of IT pros going out there and lifting and shifting existing applications from virtual machines into containers. We've seen that happening in droves, and it's amazing. I actually, I don't know if this has been published, but we're working on a case study with a customer where they were actually able to lift and shift hundreds of applications with no modification from, wait for it, Windows Server 2003
Wow.
to Windows Server Core containers. Like, talk about a modernization, program. But, and people always ask me, like, what sort of workloads are we talking about here? The most common one are, and everyone has these, your ASP.NET applications. If you have if you have an enterprise which has a bunch of ASP.NET applications, they just lift and shift. Like, you can just pick those up, drop those. Similar, if you have any Java infrastructure, it can lift and shift. If you have anything running on SQL, it can lift and shift. And with those three, that's actually like the bulk of what a lot of enterprises are running. So we have seen just a huge amount of people being able to just lift and shift their apps and get all the benefits that I talked about of like faster startup, better density, easier management, so on. So that completely surprised us. So we've had to do a bit of a pivot there. And one of the things that we've been doing over the last 12 to 18 months on that one is we've actually been, if you're aware, we have two container runtimes that we provide. We have the Nano container and the Server Core container, where the Nano is really for developing new apps, and the Server Core is for lift and shift. We've been spending more of our engineering effort on like, okay, let's go polish the Server Core image and make it even more compatible with a bigger range of applications because we're seeing a lot of effort there. So that's been the first big use case that we've seen. The second one, though, is kind of a twist on the developer one. Because once again, when we started working on the V1, we had this idea that like, this is going to be for devs writing new applications. And instead, we found a different section of developers. Everyone who's worked in an enterprise knows the story I'm going to tell, and it's going to make you all cringe a little, so I apologize for this. But everyone's worked in an enterprise where you have that one big monolithic line of business application that is critical to everything that you do, but it's like 10 years old and it really sucks. And there's been this project to build the replacement for it going for 5 years, and it's never deployed, and it's never going to deploy, and everyone is really depressed. Everyone knows this story. And what we've actually found is that we've found that containers have really helped unjam that scenario. And what we've actually seen is we've seen that people have been able to take those big monolithic applications and they've gone, okay, step one, we're going to lift and shift this to containers and we're going to get it running in containers. And step two, rather than trying to rewrite the whole damn thing, we're going to just pick a slice of it. We're going to pick a bit of it. For instance, we're going to pick authentication and how users authenticate. And we're going to step two, we're going to take that function and we're going to split it out into a separate set of containers. So we're just going to peel the onion a bit. And once we've done that, then we'll rewrite that bit. And once we've rewritten that bit, then we'll move and we'll make progress. And we've actually had a number of customers now who have come to us and said, containers have allowed us to start tackling this giant mammoth beast of an application and start modernizing it. So those are actually the two biggest use cases that we've seen. Yes, we have seen developers using it in the way that we originally thought they would, but that is easily number three.
Gotcha, gotcha. Hey, we had some good questions come in here during that answer here. One of them that I wanted to talk about, first one being about licensing. So we're talking about all these use cases, right?
Yep.
And the question was, how does Microsoft license containers? Can you talk, really quick about that?
Thankfully, this is actually quite simple. As I mentioned, we have the two types of containers. We have Windows Server containers where you get kernel isolation, and we have Hyper-V containers where you get hypervisor isolation. Windows Server containers are a free-for-all. You license Windows Server on the box or the VM, and you can run as many Windows Server containers as you want. Hyper-V containers are licensed exactly like VMs. So for most of our users, that means either you're running standard and you're paying per copy of Windows Server, or you run the data center and you get unlimited license for number of Hyper-V containers.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward when you look at it that way. Thankfully so, like you said.
I always like it when my licensing guys make that answer easy.
Right. Exactly. Because usually it's this big hairy mess of text different answers, right? So, gotcha. Well, hey, another area on this slide that I wanted to talk about specifically is, stateful or stateless. Now, I've heard it both ways. I've heard the first thing that I heard was, hey, your containers should be stateless, right? They should be, to quote again our good friend from Belgium, Didier Van Hoy, they should be treated as cattle and not holy cows, right? So that's the thing I've heard. They should be stateful. But now lately I've started hearing, it's okay to run stateful workloads inside of containers. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So I do have to be super careful answering this because this is a hugely contentious topic with a very strong proponents on either side of the world. I personally am neutral on this topic. So I'll try and present both sides of the argument. And really, so let's talk about, when we talk about stateful versus stateless, what are we actually talking about? So when we talk about a container being stateless, if you imagine a stateless container, what we're saying is you're going to have a container where you have a script or a definition file external to the system that can create that container on demand, and that any data that it needs is persisted outside of the container, so that when you run the container, you create it, you run it, and when it stops, you destroy it and you throw it away, and when you want to run it, you recreate it. That's what we talk about when we say stateless. Stateful is where you're setting up the container and it has data inside it, and you want to preserve that and you don't want it to be deleted and destroyed. Now, the people who argue for containers are stateless are coming, their heart is in the right position. They're coming from an experience of building cloud architecture and infrastructure, and they know that building your containers in a stateless manner puts you in a great position to be able to be flexible and to scale. It makes things like patching and management a lot easier, because if your containers are stateless, patching can just be kill them and restart them. There are a lot of advantages to designing your containers in a stateless way. And personally, I would encourage you, to think hard about how to do containers statelessly. Now, on the flip side, where I get a little bit grumpy and kind of poke back on people is architecturally, there's no reason why containers can't be stateful. They absolutely support stateful persistence. And when I encounter a customer where they're like, I want to use containers, but getting my workload to a stateless configuration is too hard, then I'm going to tell them like, well, you can run it in a container and it'll be stateful. It's just going to be a bit more annoying to manage. So the answer is kind of both. They can be both. You're better off if you do it stateless, but if you have an application where you're like, I can't do this statelessly, don't be like, well, I got to do it in a VM then. No, you can do it in a container. It will just need some extra care and attention.
Gotcha.
I do want to just take a call out and say someone noticed my Zelda poster, which I'm super happy about. You can't actually see the entirety of my office. My office is plastered in gaming posters. I have Zelda, I have a Skyrim, I have Mario, I have Pikmin, Morrowind.
All great games. All great games.
And to the person asking, yes, I am originally Australian. I have lived in the States for 20 years though. So my accent is quite weak.
Gotcha. Well, you mentioned management, Ben. That gives us a quick segue into this last section here. I just want to spend a couple, 3-4 minutes on this. And really the main question that I've gotten to, I've been talking to people on social here and via email the last week or so, gathering questions. When I put together, the bulk of the main questions, one of the main pieces is management.
Yep.
What's the main management mechanism for containers?
So let's so at Microsoft, so we have the Windows Server containers, we have Hyper-V containers, we also have the Linux containers on Windows, which have just recently come out, and we've built all of this in collaboration with the open source project Docker. And so if you're running just on a single box, playing around with a couple of containers, chances are you're going to be using Docker to manage those containers. Now, if you're doing this at production scale, though, you're not going to be using Docker. You need to be using some orchestration engine. And this has actually been an area that's been moving quickly and fast. About 12, 18 months ago, if I was talking about this, I would have been like, we're neutral in this. We don't have a strong recommendation. And to a large extent, we are still neutral. From a core Windows container point of view, you can use whatever orchestrator you want. Knock yourself out. There are a bunch out there. And if it works for you, great. However, from a more like pointy guidance point of view, so there are really two orchestrators that I would call out as these are the ones you should be looking at. The first one is Kubernetes. Kubernetes has absolutely, it has the most market share. Like if you go out there and you do your research and you see what people are using, it's Kubernetes. We've been heavily engaged with the Kubernetes project. We actually just had one of the guys on my team got promoted to a SIG committee chair on Kubernetes. So we're really heavily involved with them. We've been working to make sure that there's a great story using Kubernetes, managing Windows containers and Hyper-V containers. So that's a great offering. At the same time, we do have teams inside Microsoft building solutions. So the second one that I call out would be Service Fabric. And Service Fabric is a Microsoft-based offering, which is great if you're doing a really in-depth .NET development, and it integrates tightly with Windows containers for managing .NET applications. Those are really the two I would call out. I would say, chances are you're going to want to use Kube. You should also have a look at Service Fabric and see what it looks like. There are other orchestrators out there, and if you want to use them, that is fine. We're not going to be like, no. But those would be the two I would point people towards.
All right, sounds good. Well, I think we covered most of the points on that slide. So what I'm going to do now, Ben, is I want to switch gears really quick. I want to give you a couple minutes to kind of look through the questions list, see if there's any that you want to address specifically. While you're going through that list, I'm going to talk about our latest release really quick, a quick 2-3 minutes here, and then we'll get back to the final Q&A that we have scheduled. So if you haven't gotten your questions in yet, go ahead and do it now using the questions form. But while you're doing that, let me talk about Altaro VM Backup version 7.6. So this is our latest release, came out with a few weeks ago. A couple of the new features that we have in this release are continuous data protection. So now if you want to have RTOs as little as 5 minutes, you can now do that with our application. Since 7.5, we've had the ability to do offsite backups directly to Azure storage accounts, which I'm going to show you that in just a quick second. That's a real quick demo I want to show. Also at Altaro, we focus on a couple of key areas. We want your backups to be super easy to set up. We want you to have full control of those backups, so we want it to be really easy, but still provide the powerful features that you're looking for in a backup application. And we also want you to have, a fantastic support experience. If you ever need help, our support team is fantastic. We don't do tiered support. When you call, you get an answer quickly, and you get a product expert that owns your issue from start to finish. So let me just do a really quick demo here. And let me get my application out. All right. Oh, logged out on me. There we go. Hold it up right now. All right. This is where I fat finger my password because that never happens in demos, right?
This is why I always have my password in my clipboard for demos.
Yeah. Well, with my luck, I would paste it into the public chat or something like that. I'm the guy that does stuff like that. So really what I want to do really quick is just show how to set up an Azure offsite backup here with our application. So this is our dashboard. And to set up a new backup location, you go to, big surprise, the backup location section, right? So you go to backup locations, and over here on the right-hand side, we have our offsite location section. You see I already have an Azure storage account that I'm sending offsite backups to. If I wanted to add another one, I go to add offsite backup, select cloud backup to an Azure storage account, and there's one field to fill out. You just need the connection string of the storage account. So what you do is if you're not sure how to set up a storage account, you can click this link to get all the great details on exactly how to do that. Once you're done with that feature, you grab the connection string, you paste it in here, and it will actually show up as an option for offsite backups in this view. And now, to assign virtual machines to that offsite location, it's simply just a click and drag. Now, I'm not backing up that machine locally, that's why it showed red, but let me find a good one here. Let's see, DCO. So yeah, I could assign that, or if I want to just quick and dirty add the entire infrastructure to that location, I could. So that is how you do Azure offsite backups with our application. And what I'm going to do now is head back to our slideshow. And I think, Ben, you probably had enough time to kind of look through the questions list, and if there are any you want to address specifically right now, I say we can go for it. Or if you want, I can just start going down the list too. However you want to do it, my friend.
Yeah, I had a look through, and there were two that popped out where I wanted to spend some time chatting in. So the first one, we had a question: what container platform is most friendly to use or suitable for most mid-sized companies? If you were to start up a container platform at a mid-sized company, would it be Docker or would it be something else? I'm going to give a very Microsoft answer here, and so I know there are going to be some people who are going to groan a bit, but I am going to call it out. I would say, honestly, if I were at a mid-sized company and I were starting an investment in containers today, I would be doing it on Azure. Azure has native container services, and it's really cheap, really easy, and it means you don't have to manage all that hardware. And I do, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here and say I've spent a lot of time over the last 2-3 years pitching Azure to infrastructure guys, and helping infrastructure people move to Azure. And one of the things that I always step people through is, if you spend any time managing infrastructure, you've had that moment where there's been a hard drive failure at 3 in the morning. That is a cold sweat moment, and it is lovely to be able to move workloads up to the public cloud and know that you're never going to have that moment again. So running containers in Azure is a great experience, and the pricing is quite good. So that is what I would recommend. If you are running it on premises, I would, for a medium company, I would definitely recommend looking at Kubernetes. It can do a very nice 4-node cluster deployment. But in all seriousness, I would strongly recommend Azure for that. Another question that I wanted to just talk about, there was the question about, are microservices on Azure Fabric considered as part of the container definition? Also, with the rise of Docker, et cetera, does Microsoft continue to plan to continue pushing microservices as much in the near future? So in our view, and I think most of the industry agrees with us here, containers and microservices are not in competition. Containers are actually useful for your microservices platform. And this is definitely where the Service Fabric team is heading and thinking, is that, historically Service Fabric was doing microservices on Windows without any sort of virtualization protection, because virtual machines weren't light enough for them. They're now very much interested in, and they're working on, and they've been releasing versions of Service Fabric where, you can still do microservices without containers, but they're actually now recommending the way you want to do microservices is inside containers. It gives you all the characteristics of microservices, but it gives you the protection of having a virtualization layer in there. So definitely don't view these as competitive. They are complementary.
Gotcha. One of the things I'm seeing pretty common in the questions list here, Ben, is when should you choose a container over a virtual machine? When does it make more sense to go the container route, and when does it make more sense to go the VM route? There's probably not an easy answer to that question, I'm guessing, but what are kind of your thoughts on that?
My personal position on this is, and I would actually kind of flip the answer around and say, when should you choose a VM over a container?
Gotcha.
Because from my perspective, if you can run a workload in a container, you should run it in a container. There are a lot of benefits to using containers. And so from my mental model, it's like where you should start is, can I do this in a container? If I can't do this in a container, okay, let's do it in a virtual machine.
Okay.
And so from that perspective, what are the workloads that you need to run in virtual machines today? So the short answer is it all comes down to application compatibility. So from the application compatibility point of view, there are really 3 things which are going to be like, you're going to need to run that in a virtual machine. The first one is we only support latest version of Windows in containers. So if you have an app that won't run on Windows Server 2016, you're going to need to run it in a virtual machine. Now that said, our experience has been there's an awful lot of customers out there who have apps that are on Windows Server 2003, 2008, who've just never tried running it on the latest version of Windows, and when they do, it works fine. So do be warned that if you ever come to me and you're like, I need Windows 2008 to run my app, I'm going to be like, really? Have you tried? So that'd be the first thing to look at. The second thing is our containers are headless. They don't have a desktop. So if you have an application that needs to display a GUI, then that's not going to work. You'll need a VM for that. And the third thing is, which actually just got mentioned in the chat, is like, yeah, there are some core Windows services that we don't have running in containers yet. For instance, domain controllers. We're actively working on getting as much Windows functionality running in containers as possible. So you can expect to see progress there. But right now, yeah, there are some roles and features where it's like, okay, that needs a VM. So those are kind of the three big ones. But as I said, if you can run it in a container, you should.
Gotcha. Thanks, Ben. Hey, there's two things that I want to kind of wrap up with here. So the first one being, if you're new to containers, what are some good resources to kind of get started down that path of learning and then ultimately using containers? What would you recommend there?
So the first thing I would actually recommend is we actually have a really good quick start guide on the Microsoft documentation site. Let me I'm going to check to see if we have the link ready to go. If you go to docs.microsoft.com/virtualization, you will see a page will come up. There'll be a quick start using containers on Windows 10 or Windows Server. That's some great documentation. It just really steps you through in a nice, simple way how to get your first container up and running and start playing with it. So that'd honestly be the first place that I would recommend looking at.
I gotta say, if you haven't taken a look at the Docs site lately, Microsoft has done a fantastic job of getting that Docs site up to snuff. I mean, the docs.microsoft.com is leaps and years ahead of anything that's come previously. So
really nice.
Yes, it's fantastic. So, and then the next thing I want to cover, I think we got 2 minutes left. What's next? What's coming next in containers that you can talk about?
The reality is there are, when I look at what we're focused at right now, the top thing is just continuing to expand the number of workloads and the number of apps and the number of scenarios that you can use containers in. I mentioned just now, like, these things you can't do in containers, you need virtual machines. Getting those, shutting those down so that we can get more and more things running in containers is our top priority. Our second priority is when we look at Windows and the role Windows plays in containers, one of the things that we're really proud of is we think we've done a really good job on delivering a secure production-ready container platform. And I'll just tip my hat slightly to say we are looking at what can we do to kind of take that to the next level. What can we do to provide even more security guarantees and even more like deployment readiness around containers? I would say those are kind of the two big areas that we're currently focused on.
Gotcha. All right. Well, hey, Ben, I want to say thanks for taking the time to come and talk to us today. Really appreciate your time. Fantastic insights and a lot of great information, so thank you.
Yeah, and it's been a ton of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And to everyone watching, one other thing that I want to mention, if you asked a question that didn't get answered today, what we're going to do is we'll do some sort of follow-up post on the Altaro Hyper-V blog. So again, altaro.com/hyper-v. That will contain a list of questions and their associated answers, and also a link to a place where you can actually watch the recording of today's webinar. So with that, I'm going to say again, thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. And
thank you.
Yep, thank you. And then thanks everyone for watching today. We appreciate you coming, and hopefully this has been value to you. And we hope to see you again for another Altaro sponsored webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.